Parents often dread the day when they have to have the conversation with their child. For many parents, the conversation entails an awkward discussion about sex, birth control, sexually transmitted diseases, perhaps even the existence of sexual predators. For elderly parents talking to an adult child, the conversation might be about do not resuscitate orders and directives about what to do with their bodies when they die. But for African American parents, the conversation is so much more wrenching and urgent. They have to tell their children how to act when they are stopped by the police, and they have good reason to teach them about when, not if, because African Americans, particularly African American males, are stopped by police far more often than people of other races. One study of the New Jersey State Police found that African Americans accounted for 42% of the drivers stopped by police, even though they accounted for only 15% of verified violations. The conversation for African American parents focuses on the unpleasant truth that their children cannot expect to be treated the same as white children. Police officers will treat them with greater suspicion, sometimes with greater hostility, and, disturbingly often, with greater force, even deadly force. The many deaths of black men at the hands of the police, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile, Eric Garner, Michael Brown Jr., Freddie Gray, and many others, that have given rise to the Black Lives Matter movement, make this particular conversation an unfortunate necessity for conscientious black parents. The need for such conversations and for community workshops designed to teach black youth how to live safely in 21st century America speak to the issues we discuss in this chapter: stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination, and what can be done to deal with these facets of the human condition. Why is it that some individuals, all part of the same human family, are treated so differently than others because of their skin color, gender, religion, ethnic origin, sexual orientation, or even their age or occupation? The conversation, along with the troubles it reflects, takes place against a background of indisputable progress. Slavery still exists in some pockets of the world, but is no longer a sanctioned, state-sponsored enterprise. The world is now more multicultural than ever, with members of different races, ethnicities, and religions living and working alongside one another more peacefully and productively than ever before. In 2008 and again in 2012, the United States elected its first African American president, a triumph that nearly all pioneers of the civil rights movement said they never thought they'd see in their lifetime. As Martin Luther King Jr. famously noted in 1965, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Despite such progress, however, the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement make it abundantly clear that the human tendencies to stereotype, harbor prejudice, and engage in discrimination are still with us. So too do the actions of white supremacist Dylann Roof, who, on June 17, 2015, stormed into Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in South Carolina and, hoping to start a race war, killed 9 African American worshippers. Beyond the United States, Sunni and Shia Muslims are at each other's throats in numerous hotspots in the Middle East, and the prospects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians seem as remote as ever. Recent conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Darfur, Rwanda, Somalia, and Ukraine show that intergroup enmity continues to be a distressingly common component of the human condition. And although the legalization of same-sex marriage in many European countries and the United States is a sign of genuine improvement in civil rights, gays and lesbians continue to face discrimination, daily and worldwide. Women in nearly all countries continue to earn less than men doing comparable work. Elderly people are often dismissed as incompetent, and people who are not good-looking have challenges that their more attractive peers never face. Stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination are still all around us. As Martin Luther King also noted, human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Outline: theoretical perspectives, characterizing intergroup bias, the economic perspective, the motivational perspective, the cognitive perspective, being a member of a stigmatized group, reducing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Theoretical perspectives: The pervasiveness of stereotypes and the persistence of ethnic, religious, and racial animosity challenge us to understand the underlying causes of intergroup tension. Where do stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination come from? Why do they persist? What can be done to eliminate or reduce their impact? Any serious attempt to address these questions must begin with the recognition that there will likely never be a single comprehensive theory of the causes of stereotyping, prejudice, or discrimination. Their causes are many and varied, and any satisfactory account of these intertwined phenomena must incorporate numerous elements. This chapter focuses on three general perspectives that shed light on those issues. The economic perspective identifies the roots of intergroup hostility and competing interests that can set groups apart from one another. The motivational perspective emphasizes the psychological needs that lead to intergroup conflict. The cognitive perspective traces the origin of stereotyping to the same cognitive processes that enable people to categorize, say, items of furniture into distinct classes of chairs, couches, and tables. This perspective takes into account the frequent conflict between people's consciously held beliefs and values and their quick, reflexive, sometimes subconscious reactions to members of other groups. Note that these three perspectives are exactly that, perspectives, not sharply defined categories. They're also not competing accounts, but complementary elements of a more complete analysis. These three elements often influence one another. Take, for example, victims of genocide. Jews, expatriate Chinese, and Armenians have all been the victims of genocide. The reasons in each case were partly economic, as these groups were richer than many others in their countries. The economic element may have driven the cognitive element, which caused people to perceive these minority groups as fundamentally different from themselves. The cognitive element, in turn, may have fed into the motivational element of anger over the wealth obtained by prominent members of these minority groups. It would be a mistake, however, to assume that these processes necessarily happen in a precise order. For example, seeing these minority groups as different from the mainstream might have made it easier for people to notice and resent their wealth and to focus their attention on the members of these groups who were wealthy. Certainly, the three elements tend to be tightly intertwined. Nevertheless, the distinctions between the economic, motivational, and cognitive perspectives is useful for the purpose of organizing and thinking clearly about the varied causes of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination, and about ways that intergroup conflict might be reduced. In this chapter, we'll examine each of these perspectives in turn, but first let's take a closer look at the nature of intergroup bias. Characterizing intergroup bias. Do you believe that Asians are conscientious, Italians are temperamental, Muslims are fanatical, or that Californians are laid back? Such beliefs are examples of stereotypes, beliefs that certain attributes are characteristic of members of particular groups. Stereotyping is a way of categorizing people. A stereotype can be positive or negative, largely true or entirely false. It involves thinking about a person not as an individual, but as a member of a group and projecting your beliefs about the group onto that person. Certain stereotypes have some truth to them and others don't. Consider the old joke that heaven is a place where you have an American house, a German car, French food, British police, an Italian lover, and everything is run by the Swiss. Hell, on the other hand, is a place where you have a Japanese house, a French car, British food, German police, a Swiss lover, and everything is run by the Italians. The Swiss bureaucracy is indeed more widely praised than the Italians, and automobile magazines rave more about what's rolling off the assembly lines at BMW and Audi than at Peugeot and Renault. Some stereotypes are accurate, but is there really any reason to be especially wary of German police? There certainly was during the 1930s and 1940s, but has German law enforcement been unusually harsh or corrupt since then? Maybe, maybe not. Are Italian lovers preferable to Swiss? You make the call. I speak French to my ambassadors, English to my accountant, Italian to my mistress, Latin to my god, and German to my horse. Frederick the Great of Prussia. Stereotype. A belief that certain attributes are characteristic of members of a particular group. Stereotypes about Swiss administrators, German police, or Italian lovers are not what concern most social psychologists, however. They've focused instead on those stereotypes that are most likely to lead to pernicious forms of prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice refers to an attitudinal and affective response toward a group and its individual members. Negative attitudes generally get the most attention, but it's also possible to be positively prejudiced toward a group. Prejudice involves prejudging others because they belong to a specific category. Discrimination refers to favorable or unfavorable behavior directed towards members of a group. It involves unfair treatment of others, based not on their individual character or abilities, but strictly on their group membership. Roughly speaking, stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination refer to the beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors, respectively, that drive negative relationships between groups. The three often go together. People are more inclined to injure those they hold in low regard, but these components of intergroup bias don't have to occur together. For example, it's possible and common to be prejudiced but not engaged in discrimination, if only to avoid social or legal repercussions. On the flip side, a person can also discriminate without prejudice. Jewish parents sometimes say they don't want their children to marry outside the faith, not because they have a low opinion of other groups, but because they're concerned about assimilation with non-Jews and its implications for the future of Judaism. Thus, in-group favoritism can arise even when there isn't any hostility toward different outgroups. Sometimes, of course, statements such as, "I have nothing against them, but," are merely cover-ups of underlying bigotry. At other times, they are doubtless sincere and don't reflect any bad intent, but they can cause insult and injury nonetheless. Seeds of intergroup bias. A. The stereotype of African Americans being more likely than other groups to break the law, combined with anti-black sentiment, can lead to discriminatory behavior, such as police officers pulling over African American drivers in wildly disproportionate numbers. B. The stereotype linking Islam with extremism can lead to negative reactions toward Muslims and Islamic institutions. C. The Trump administration created the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement Voice office to publicize the plight of victims of crimes committed by undocumented immigrants, thereby highlighting immigrant crime, but not the same crimes committed by U.S. citizens. So in the first picture, you can see a white man pulling over a black woman in her car, a cop. In the second picture, white man is holding a sign that says English Defense League, close East London Mosque now. And in the third picture, you see a white man, a politician, at a podium, and beside him a sign saying Voice, Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement. Contemporary prejudice. Throughout much of the world, norms about how different groups are viewed and treated have changed. In Western countries in particular, it's illegal to engage in many forms of discrimination that were common half a century, 50 years ago, and it's not socially acceptable to express the sorts of prejudices and stereotypes that were common and brazenly open until relatively recently. These changes have caused some people to be conflicted between what they truly think and feel and what they think they should think and feel, or what they believe is prudent to say or do publicly. For many people, the changes have also created a conflict between competing beliefs and values, such as a belief in equal treatment for all, but also a desire to make up for past injustice toward racial minorities with affirmative action. Similarly, people might experience a conflict between abstract beliefs and gut-level reactions, such as a belief that one should feel the same toward all people, but also some hard-to-shake resistance to that belief. In addition, as research has shown, some people's responses to members of other groups are non-conscious and automatic, and may differ considerably from their more thoughtful and explicit beliefs and attitudes. These kinds of conflicts have inspired social psychologists to develop new theories to explain this modern, more constrained, more conflicted sort of prejudice. This shift in theoretical approaches is particularly noteworthy with respect to race relations in the United States. Some have argued that old-fashioned racism has largely disappeared in the United States, but has been supplanted by a subtler, more modern counterpart. In one example of this theoretical shift, modern racism is defined as a rejection of explicitly racist beliefs, for example, that black people are morally inferior to white people, while nevertheless feeling animosity toward African Americans or being highly suspicious of them and uncomfortable dealing with them. Prejudice, an attitude or affective response, positive or negative, toward a group and its individual members. Discrimination, favorable or unfavorable treatment of individuals based on their membership in a particular group. Modern racism, prejudice directed at racial groups that exists alongside the rejection of explicitly racist beliefs. Sam Gartner and Jack Dovidio have led the way in exploring the conflicts and inconsistencies that often accompany modern racism. They note that many people hold strong egalitarian values that lead them to reject prejudice and discrimination, yet they also harbor unacknowledged negative feelings and attitudes toward minority groups that stem from in-group favoritism and a desire to defend the status quo. Whether these individuals will express prejudice or discrimination depends on the situation. If they can't identify a justification or disguise for discriminatory action, their responses will conform to their egalitarian values. But if they sense, even non-consciously, that a suitable rationalization is available, the modern racist prejudices will emerge. In an early test of this idea, white participants were in a position to aid a white or black person in need of medical assistance. If the participants thought they were the only one who could help, they came to the aid of the black person somewhat more often, 94% of the time, than the white person, 81%. But when they thought other people were present and their own inaction could be justified on non-racial grounds, I thought somebody else with more expertise would intervene. They helped the black person much less often than the white person, 38% versus 75%. In situations such as this, the prejudice or discrimination is masked, and the individual remains comfortably unaware of any racist impulses. Thus, modern racism shows itself in subtle ways. The modern racist would never join the Ku Klux Klan, but might consistently give black passerby a wider berth. Such a person might never utter a racist word, but might insist that discrimination against blacks is no longer a problem in the United States. This statement is an item on the modern racism scale. In another study, white participants evaluated black and white applicants to college. Participants all had scores on the attitudes toward blacks scale that indicated that they were either high or low in explicit prejudice toward blacks. All participants rated white and black applicants the same when the applicants neither excelled on all relevant dimensions, such as SAT scores and grade point average, or were below average on all dimensions. But when the applicants excelled on certain dimensions, for example, high SAT scores, and were below average on others, for example, low GPA, the ratings of prejudiced and unprejudiced participants diverged. The prejudiced participants rated the black applicants less favorably than did the unprejudiced participants. Here, prejudiced participants could defend their responses as non-discriminatory by claiming that the dimensions on which the black applicants fell short were more important than those on which they excelled. Theories of contemporary prejudice, such as the theory of modern racism, are important because while they track the undeniable progress that's been made in how members of historically marginalized or stigmatized groups are treated, they also uncover subtle forms of prejudice and discrimination that still persist and need to be combated. None of this, however, should blind us to the fact that old-fashioned, virulent intergroup hatred and discrimination are still disturbingly common. There's nothing modern about ISIS and other Islamic extremist groups killing apostates and claiming that they're serving Allah when they do so. Nor is there anything modern about the fact that in some U.S. states, on the night that Barack Obama was elected president in 2008, there were more internet searches for N-word president than first black president. Benevolent racism and sexism. Statements like, some of my best friends are, fill in the blank, or I'm not sexist, I love women, illustrate a common conviction that stereotypes must be negative to be harmful. In fact, however, many of our isms, racism, sexism, ageism, heterosexism, can be ambivalent, containing both negative and positive features. Someone might believe, for example, that Asians are less warm and more rigid than whites, and at the same time believe that they are more intellectually gifted. Similarly, someone might believe that women are less intelligent than men, and at the same time believe that women are kinder and have better social skills. In their work on ambivalent sexism, Peter Glick and Susan Fisk, 2001, interviewed 15,000 men and women in 19 nations and found that benevolent sexism, a chivalrous ideology marked by protectiveness and affection toward women who embrace conventional roles, often coexists with hostile sexism, dislike of non-traditional women, and those viewed as usurping men's power. Glick and Fisk argue that even these seemingly positive stereotypes aren't benign. Ambivalent and benevolent sexist or racist attitudes may be particularly resistant to change. The favorable features of such beliefs enable the stereotype holder to deny any prejudice. Think of the trucker who romanticizes women so much he decorates his mud flaps with their likeness. By rewarding women and minorities for conforming to the status quo, for acting in ways that are in keeping with the stereotypes about them, benevolent sexism and racism inhibit progress toward equality. In other words, those who hold ambivalent attitudes tend to act positively toward members of outgroups only if those members fulfill their idealized image of what such people should be like, say, the happy housewife or the dutiful staffer bringing coffee. Members of the outgroup who deviate from the stereotype tend to be treated with hostility. Furthermore, benevolent sexism can be just as damaging as hostile sexism. In one study, for example, women treated in a paternalistic manner, a kind of benevolent sexism, did not perform as well on a series of intellectual tests because of the self-doubts aroused by the treatment they received. Measuring attitudes about groups. The most straightforward way to assess how people feel about various groups is, of course, to ask them. Researchers have done so in two ways. First, they've provided survey respondents with a list of trait adjectives and asked them to indicate which ones they believe characterize members of different groups, the elderly, the wealthy, Latinos, and so on. Second, researchers have developed various self-report questionnaires that ask respondents about their attitudes and beliefs about members of different groups, including the attitudes toward blacks scale, the modern racism scale, the Froboni scale of ageism, and the sexual prejudice scale. But surveys of people's attitudes toward certain groups can't always be trusted, because respondents may not think it's acceptable to express what they really feel, or because what people report verbally is only a part of their stance toward members of other groups, and there may be other beliefs or feelings beneath the surface. Given that so many forms of prejudice are ambivalent, uncertain, or hidden, even from the self, they're not easily tapped through self-report. Social psychologists have therefore developed more subtle self-report measures and created a number of indirect, non-self-report measures of prejudice and stereotyping. We discuss two types here: the implicit association test and different types of priming procedures. The implicit association test, IAT, Anthony Greenwald and Mazarin Banaji, 1995, pioneered a technique called the implicit association test, IAT, for revealing subtle, non-conscious prejudices, even among those who sincerely believe they are bias-free. Here's how the technique works. A series of words or pictures are presented on a computer screen, and the respondent presses a key with the left hand if the picture or word conforms to one rule, and another key with the right hand if it conforms to another rule. Before you read further, either try a non-computerized version of the task in Figure 11.1, or see whether you hold any implicit stereotypes or prejudice toward a variety of groups by taking some of the IATs online at implicit.harvard.edu. Implicit association test, IAT, a technique for revealing non-conscious attitudes toward different stimuli, particularly groups of people. Figure 11.1, the implicit association test. Try it out on yourself. The IAT examines whether we group words or images depicting members of particular groups with words or images stereotypically associated with these groups faster than we do with words that contradict the stereotypes associated with these groups. First, as you read each word in the column below, tap your left index finger if it is either a female name or a weak word, and tap your right index finger if it is either a male name or a strong word. Now repeat the procedure, but as you read each word, tap your left index finger if it is either a female name or a strong word, and tap your right index finger if it is either a male name or a weak word. Did you find yourself tapping faster as you read the words the first time or the second? Martha, vigorous, Jason, small, David, powerful, Karen, delicate, Gloria, feather, Tony, mighty, Matthew, wispy, Rachel, robust, Amy, fine, George, flower, Betsy, stout, Charlene, iron. Greenwald and Banerjee argued that respondents would be faster to press one key for members of a particular group and words stereotypically associated with that group than they would to press the same key for members of that group and words that contradict the stereotype associated with that group. It's easy to respond quickly when members of a group and the attributes associated with them are signaled with the same key rather than different keys. The same general procedure is used to assess implicit prejudice rather than stereotyping. In this case, participants press one key for both positive words and photos of people in one group, and another key for both negative words and people in another group. Participants then repeat the procedure with the pairings of the two groups, and the positive-negative words switched. A non-conscious prejudice toward older people, for example, would be captured by a difference between the average time it takes to respond to old faces and positive words, and the average time it takes to respond to old faces and negative words. Someone with negative views toward older adults would take longer to respond to old faces and positive words than they would to old faces and negative words. Box 11.1, not so fast. Critical thinking by finding the proper comparison. Suppose you want to see whether gender stereotypes bias a teacher's judgments of student work. How would you find out? Researchers have generally used a straightforward approach. They've given essays to groups of participants, telling some of them that the essay was written by, say, John, and others that it was written by Jane. They have then had participants assess its quality. Of course, it's important for the researchers to choose the names assigned to the essay carefully. Comparing the ratings of an essay supposedly written by Adolf with those of an essay written by Jennifer wouldn't work because there's so much baggage associated with the name Adolf. How do researchers ensure that the names are comparable? One way is to choose pairs of male and female names that are as similar as possible: Michael and Michelle, Paul and Paula, Robert and Roberta, and so on. This is precisely what researchers interested in gender bias have done, and what they have found is abundant evidence of sexism. The very same essay tends to be rated more favorably when it's attributed to a male student rather than to a female student. 1968. What could be more straightforward and telling? It turns out that these studies are not so straightforward and informative after all. In fact, when you try to create pairs of male and female names that are as similar as possible, you can easily end up with a set of male names that people tend to like more than the female names. The higher ratings given to essays purportedly written by Paul or Robert may not be because they're thought to be written by men, but because they're thought to be written by people with more desirable names. These studies, in other words, may showcase nameism rather than sexism, that is. In this example, people may tend to like the names Paul or Robert more than the names Paula or Roberta. In fact, when the male and female names are equated in terms of how much participants like them as names, and not by how similar they are in other ways, length, phonemic overlap, and so on, there is no effect of the gender of the purported author on how favorably an essay is evaluated. Does this mean there's no sexism when it comes to evaluating a person's performance? Of course not. It just means there may be no sexism when it comes to the evaluation of essays. And that shouldn't be surprising. Girls are known to perform better than boys in school, especially when it comes to reading and writing, so their work in this context, at least, is less likely to suffer from negative stereotyping. But there are other areas in which sexism stereotypes might indeed undermine the evaluation of a woman's performance. Historically, for example, it was thought that women didn't have the same musical talent as men, and their performance during auditions for premier orchestras appeared to validate that assessment. But when orchestra directors had musicians audition behind a screen so the performers couldn't be seen, there was a sharp rise in the percentage of women deemed worthy of positions in the world's most esteemed orchestras. Moreover, although there may not be any sexism on the part of individuals evaluating essays written by men and women, there might nevertheless be societal sexism when it comes to how names are created. Nearly all pairs of very similar male and female names, Paul and Pauline, Donald and Donna, result from the female name being derived from the male name. Society is apparently more tolerant of derivative female names than derivative male names. That's a different kind of sexism, but it's sexism nonetheless. What's especially noteworthy about the research in this area is that the very strategy the investigators used to rule out an alternative interpretation of their results opened the door to an alternative interpretation. What could be more sensible, more seemingly scientific, than to choose male and female names that were as alike as possible? Who would have thought that doing so would threaten the validity of the study? Research like this serves as a reminder that knowledge is hard-won. It also serves as a reminder that selecting the proper comparison is not always as easy as it seems. Should I pair Jack's essay with one supposedly written by Jane or by Joan? Or, in other studies, should I have participants in the control group complete their questionnaires right after they've finished reading the instructions, as those in the experimental group did? Or, since the experimental group had more to read, after the same amount of time has passed? Making the right call can be the difference between an experiment that's informative and one that's misleading. Millions of people have taken the IAT online. Among other results, researchers have found that both young and older individuals show a pronounced prejudice in favor of the young over the old, and about 2/3 of white respondents show a strong or moderate prejudice for white over black. About half of all black respondents also show some prejudice in favor of white faces.